Okay, so this is the origins of Jim Crow, part two. We left off last time talking about the reasons for the emergence of this repressive racial system in the southern United States, the system of disenfranchisement and segregation, which was made part of the law of the land throughout the South in the 1890s and the early 20th century. We talked about four major reasons for why this occurred. One was generational change. The second was the growth of scientific racism. The third was northern apathy. And the fourth was the legacy of populism. So now we understand why Southern whites were behaving so aggressively towards the black population in their midst around the turn of the century. But what about African Americans? How did the black community respond to this increasingly threatening environment in the South at the turn of the century? Well, essentially, they responded in three main ways. One was through direct protest. This is political agitation against what is going on in the South at that time. The second would be a renewed emphasis on community development, building up and improving their own communities despite what is going on around them. And then the third response would be migration or flight, that is, leaving the South and going to other places. So let's talk about each of these responses in turn. First, let's talk about protest. There were a variety of individuals and groups leading the black protest effort against the repressive racial order that was being created in the South during this time. The first individual that I'd like to talk about was W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois is somewhat unique for his time period in that he was both a political activist and a scholar, an intellectual. He was probably one of the most well-educated African Americans in the country during his lifetime. He was the first black person to earn a PhD from Harvard University. He earned a PhD in history from Harvard. He also wrote a well-known book called The Souls of Black Folk. And in that book and his other writings, he advocated cultivating something that he called the talented tenth. Now, what is the talented tenth? The talented tenth was the native black leadership class of the United States. They were the roughly 10% or so of African Americans who, by virtue of their education, their background, their educational opportunities, their economic status, would be in a position to lead the black community in political protest and agitation against the Jim Crow system. The second black protest leader whom I want to highlight in this section would be Ida B. Wells. She's the lady pictured in the center there. Wells was a female black journalist who became in the early 20th century probably the foremost anti-lynching activist in the United States. She focused a good bit of her teaching, lecturing, and writing career on the cause of abolishing lynching throughout the United States. And she did a great deal of publicizing. She did a great deal of her work was publicizing specific instances of lynching that were occurring throughout the South and elsewhere in the country as well during this period. One of the things that she did was to document specific instances, specific cases of lynching, and to really research the evidence surrounding that particular case. And she argued that most of the time, the lynchings that occurred actually involved an innocent person being put to death for a crime that they did not commit, or at least there was not sufficient evidence to prove that they had committed this crime. In most cases where there was uh, a white woman who had accused a black man of raping her, she argued that in point of fact, the sex had been consensual, not rape. And she also argued that in any event, there was never any excuse for lynching because had a rape actually occurred, then justice would see the perpetrator tried by a jury of his peers, not put to death at the end of a rope by a mob. She also highlighted the hypocrisy of lynching by pointing out the frequency of sexual intercourse between white men and black women, both before emancipation and afterwards. She said to white men, look, if miscegenation is so bad, why are there so many people of mixed race in the South? Why did so many white slave masters have sex with their female black slaves? Why do so many white men, even after uh, emancipation, continue to carry on sexual relationships with black women? She basically highlighted the hypocrisy of the Southern lynch mob in killing people, killing black men who allegedly had crossed the color line by having sex with a white woman, um, whereas white men who had sex with black women were not, of course, subject to the same treatment. And the third example of black protest during this period is not an individual, but rather a group that I'd like to highlight, and that is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. This was an organization founded in 1909, and it was created to carry out campaigns to carry out political and legal campaigns to protect black civil rights. It was created to lobby Congress to pass laws protecting black people from discrimination and disenfranchisement. It also created legal defense teams, including both black and white lawyers who would litigate cases attempting to overturn various aspects of the Jim Crow system. It used the law in an attempt to advance black interests and black civil liberties in the South at a time when there really was no other comparable organization dedicated to protecting their rights. The second response to the emergence of Jim Crow was community development. There was, as strong as the black protest tradition was, there were other voices within the African American community calling for a renewed emphasis on change and development within the black community. Black people helping other black people achieve a better life for themselves through self-help, through economic cooperation, and so on. And probably the leading voice advocating this response was Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was a former slave born in Virginia. He was an educator, renowned educator and public speaker. He founded the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, which focused on spreading mechanical, vocational, and agricultural education among African Americans in that area. His views were in many ways a counterpoint to those of Du Bois. He said that what African Americans really needed was not to cultivate some well-educated, politically active, talented tenth. What they really needed was to focus on providing industrial or vocational pursuits to the broad majority of African Americans. He said, cultivating the talented tenth is all well and good, but that leads behind the untalented 90%. What are you going to do about them? How are you going to help them? Are you just going to leave them to wallow in poverty? So he said what African Americans should really be focusing on doing is creating their own institutions, their own schools, their own colleges, their own cooperative societies to help the other black people, to help themselves get a leg up. And the Tuskegee Institute is just one of many examples of that. Washington also worried about the crushing poverty that the great mass of black sharecroppers and tenant farmers in the South experienced on a day-to-day basis, and he worried that if allowed to continue, this poverty would ultimately undermine or thwart all efforts at black community development and mutual economic improvement. And he understood, or he believed, that if African Americans were ultimately going to be able to lift themselves up out of poverty, that to some extent at least they would need help. They would need help indeed even from the white community amongst whom they lived. And to that end, he advocated that the black and white communities in the South work together economically to achieve the common goal of a prosperous and a economically progressive South. This is the basic message that he put forward in his famous Atlanta Compromise speech delivered at the Atlanta Exposition in 1895, which I'm going to have you read a part of. Um, he argued that if the South was going to progress, blacks and whites needed to work together for their own mutual economic benefit, and that they should, at least for the foreseeable future, put aside questions of social or political equality. He essentially promised the white South that if blacks received economic aid, that they would not, at least for the time being, protest um, for their full civil and political rights. They would not attack the system of segregation right now, but would be willing to wait until the white South was ready for change. Not surprisingly, this was a message that made Washington very popular, not just among his fellow African Americans in the South, but even among the white Southern community. He received a lot of speaking engagements. He got a lot of endorsements and financial donations for his school, the Tuskegee Institute. This message also helped make him a key player within the Republican Party, the National Republican Party, because the one place where Southern blacks did have a certain amount of political influence was the Republican National Convention that nominated the GOP's presidential candidate every 4 years. It was well known that Booker T. Washington could sway black delegates to the RNC, and that could potentially affect who would be nominated by the Republican Party as president. So it not only helped him achieve fame and notoriety and financial success, but it also made Booker T. Washington a politically significant figure, probably the most politically important black American in the country during much of his lifetime. Another voice for black community development came from the National Urban League. This was an organization founded in New York City in 1911, and it focused on trying to improve the lives of African Americans living in big cities in the North and also in the Midwest. It promoted black business development and job opportunities. It worked to help African Americans moving to the cities find housing and find jobs that they could fill. It really attempted to facilitate or improve the prospects of African Americans moving to the cities, of which there were many during this period. And of course, that brings us to the third major response, black response to the Jim Crow system, and that is migration or flight. Uh, Basically, from the 1890s going forward, tens of thousands, and then ultimately hundreds of thousands, and eventually millions of black people living in the South looked around at their society. They saw all of the racial violence, the race riots, the lynchings, the segregation ordinances, the disenfranchisement legislation. They saw that the South was becoming less and less hospitable to them, and they essentially said, I am getting the heck out of here. The impulse to escape from the South can be seen in a variety of ways. It can be seen, among other things, in a movement called the Back to Africa movement. This was essentially a neo-colonization movement headed by black leaders who called for African Americans to move back to their ancestral homeland in Africa. They said the United States is not the place for us. All of the things that are going on prove that. The Jim Crow laws, the uh, racial segregation ordinances, the disenfranchisement laws, all of these things demonstrate that white Americans will never truly allow African Americans to be their equals. And that therefore, the appropriate response for American black people should be to move back to Africa, to leave white Americans to stew in their own juices and just separate. One black leader who advocated this approach was Marcus Garvey. Garvey is an interesting character. He's actually not a native born American. He was born in Jamaica, but he actually lived throughout in many different countries in Central and South America. He actually lived over in Europe for a period of time. He didn't move to the United States until much later in his adulthood. But he was a talented writer and orator who preached a message of black self-reliance, empowerment, and separatism. He said whites in the United States would never uh, truly recognize or treat or be willing to treat African Americans as their equals. So the only solution was for black people in the United States to remove themselves from that situation entirely and go home, go back to Africa. Garvey and his followers um, created a number of organizations designed to further that goal. One of them was the United Negro Improvement Association, created in 1914. It's also known as the UNI. Um, in 1919, they actually founded their own steamship company. It was a corporation called the Black Star Line, which was a steamship company designed to facilitate the transfer of African American settlers going back to their homeland in Africa. Along those lines, Garvey actually attempted to convince the government of Liberia to give American blacks land on which to settle once they returned. However, he was unsuccessful in persuading the government to do that. Ultimately, however, despite all of these efforts, we know that the Back to Africa movement eventually faded away, and it did not succeed in its ultimate goal of resettling large numbers of black people on the African continent. It turned out that while there were many black people in the United States who liked the idea of separating from the white race, they usually weren't willing to go to Africa in order to achieve that goal. They were, after all, Americans. They had grown up here. They had lived here all their lives. They knew American culture. They knew the English language. They did not know anything about Africa. And so the idea of actually uprooting themselves and their families and moving to a foreign country, a completely alien place, just wasn't very pragmatic. Far more significant to the future history of the United States than the Back to Africa movement was black migration to the north, as well as to other parts of the country. In the decade of the 1890s alone, around 300,000 black people moved from the South to cities in the North, the Midwest, and also out on the West Coast in California. The 1890s marked the beginning of something that historians typically refer to as the Great Migration. The Great Migration was a massive population transfer in which ultimately around 7 million African Americans left the South and went to live in other parts of the country. Again, primarily cities, large cities in the North, in the Midwest, and out on the West Coast in places like Los Angeles and San Francisco, California, and so on. And this process proceeded over the period of about 80 years, from around the 1890s through about 1970. The consequences of this migration were profound, both for African Americans and for white Americans, for the North, for the South, and for the nation at large. Um, for one thing, the Great Migration changed the racial makeup of the nation. Prior to about 1890, the predominant black experience in the United States had been a southern and a rural experience. That is to say, most African Americans lived in the South and they lived in rural areas. Now, increasing numbers of them are living in the North and they're living in big cities. The second consequence of this migration is that it brought racial conflict to the North, as large numbers of African Americans began moving into northern cities, into places like Chicago and Philadelphia and New York and Boston, and even out on the West Coast in Los Angeles and elsewhere. They are competing for housing and for jobs that had previously only been available to white people. And as a result, there's a lot of tension, a lot of hostility, and ultimately a lot of conflict that emerges between urban working class whites and their new African American competitors.